Weed, cannabis, the good kush, sweet Mary Jane. She's been around a long time, over 5,000 years in fact, and in that time the infamous drug has racked up some incredible stories and uses. How did this bud ignite a war? Why does India have a weed milkshake? And did you know that in the 1930s, they made an infamously bad propaganda film about how weed would turn you into a psychopathic killer? We're ganja tell you all this and more. Welcome to the wild, wacky history of weed. Let's begin with the basics. What exactly is weed? Marijuana is a drug that comes from the cannabis plant, an ancient flora that's been used all over the world for centuries for its medicinal, spiritual, and agricultural properties. The latter is more commonly known as hemp. The seeds of the plant can be used for food. The oils and fibers produced by hemp can be made into clothing, paper, and ropes, which was very useful as those things were in high demand. And one plant could do it all. Now, we aren't really sure when exactly the cannabis plant popped out of the ground, since we weren't alive back then, unless there's a secret immortal hiding away the truth. And if you're an immortal watching this, please let us know in the comments. We know it's incredibly old, that much is certain. Lucky for us, there are scientists dedicated to finding out the answers. They haven't found all of them yet, but we hear they're still looking. So for the sake of brevity, let's keep this to weed's history with the human race. Our first stop on this dank adventure brings us to China. Cannabis sativa, weed's maiden name, had been established as a useful farming crop in this region due to its fast-growing nature and ability to produce textiles, fiber, and grain. Around 2700 BC, legendary Chinese emperor Shen Nong, whose name means divine farmer or divine husbandman, reportedly discovered the health benefits of the plant, using it to treat a variety of ailments which were cataloged in a book known by many names. Still, his friends call it Pen Sao Ching, the divine husbandman's materia medica. The emperor earned a new title thanks to his teachings, now considered the father of Chinese medicine. Most of us are lucky if we get one cool title in our life. Good old Emperor Shen Nong couldn't get enough. How MJ became global after its debut is likely thanks to the infamous ancient trading route, the Silk Road, or Silk Route. This 4,000-mile journey between China and Europe is believed to be the key in how cannabis spread its leafy wings and took people higher, quite literally, as one of the travel paths merchants took up into the Pamir Mountains. These mountains contain Jerzan Cemetery, an ancient burial site that would unknowingly shine a light on some massive weed mysteries. Approximately 2,500 years later, these tombs were excavated, and you'll never guess what they found. That's right, bones! Bones that were carbon dated to about 500 BC. But buried with the bones were wooden burners that would burn a special plant. Can you guess which one? It was cannabis sativa, and if you guessed that, feel free to take any prize from the middle shelf. Historians and archaeologists have extrapolated that ancient mourners in this area would add cannabis seeds to the hot stones and inhale smoke while burying the deceased or visiting. The oldest known evidence of humans smoking the herb. We told you this stuff was old school. They don't call it the OG Kush for nothing. Whether ritualistic or to simply hide the rotting stench of the corpses with its distinctive smell, the cannabis found in those braziers was unique when compared to previously found specimens. It contained a high level of tetrahydrocannabinol. Now, for those of us who can't afford $5 words, THC. The psychoactive chemical is what stimulates the brain and allows one to enter a higher plane while smoking a bowl, metaphorically speaking. In 440 BC, Greek historian Herodotus was traveling the world. Around this time, his travels led him to meet the Scythians, a fierce nomadic tribe that originated from what's now known as Siberia, but spread across Central Asia from 900 BC until 200 BC. Herodotus reported that the warriors would build weed saunas, using tents and hot rocks to inhale the fumes, which made the Scythians cry out in ecstasy. So we have anecdotal evidence that we can thank the Scythians for the original hot box. Weed has been a consistent part of many rituals, ceremonies, and festivals for centuries. In India, bhang is made from the cannabis plant and has deep religious ties to the Hindu god Shiva. Some mythological accounts speak of bhang being Lord Shiva's favorite offering, and the Hindu god is often depicted with the substance in portraits. Since the 5th century, bhang has been consumed at the iconic celebrations Holi and Mahashivratri, where it's typically infused in traditional drinks like lassi and thandai. And in case you weren't aware, thandai is a cold, milky beverage. That's right, a weed milkshake. As time went on, cannabis became prominent in Asia, Africa, and Europe, sailing across the seas, which was convenient as hemp was widely used for ships' rigging and sails. And did we already mention rope? Hemp became popular among the white settlers of the Americas in the mid-1600s for agricultural use in the colonies. Did you know that the first president of the United States, George Washington, grew his own hemp crop at Mount Vernon? Well, now you do. In 1833, an Irish physician named Dr. William Brooke O'Shaughnessy came to India, where he would spend many years researching the medical benefits after noting the locals using bhang as a remedy. O'Shaughnessy believed cannabis was an untapped medical resource for Western medicine. He used the plant in an attempt to cure patients suffering from illnesses like rheumatism and cholera. His experiments concluded that cannabis wasn't a cure, but could be used as part of the treatment. O'Shaughnessy also claimed cannabis to be anti-convulsive medication, reportedly using it to stop seizures of a baby and ease the tremors in tetanus patients. Enter cannabis indicate. Cannabis indica was a new strain of cannabinoid, getting the nickname Indian hemp or more famously ganja. New year, new weed. This strain was noted to have added relaxation effects with a side effect of increased delirium. O'Shaughnessy's research paved the way for cannabis to be recognized and used in Western medicine. It became widely accessible in the medical field and popular as an over-the-counter remedy. A staple ingredient in all kinds of concoctions and elixirs, some of those included other drugs such as poppy opium and cocaine, which was incredibly common during the 19th and 20th centuries. In 1850, cannabis appeared for the first time in the United States Pharmacopoeia, a compendium of all the most important drugs in American medicine. Meanwhile, during that same decade in France, the Club des Hashichans was formed, which celebrated more recreational use of the wacky tobacco. But the story of weed isn't all sunshine and roses. While weed use got a head start, anti-weed legislation had been carefully marching along behind it. All the way back in 1378, over in the sunny land of Arabia, Sodoyun Shekoni, the emir of Jonemia, banned the smoking of hash in his domain, which many historians seem to agree was the first time someone legislated against marijuana officially. Marijuana would have an easy ride for a few centuries after that, until the King of Jamaica brought down the ban hammer in 1787. Yes, Jamaica. In the 1800s, for all the advances in marijuana use, both medical and otherwise, that it gave us, there were plenty among the powers that be who were striking back. To name a few, Napoleon Bonaparte, the Municipal Council of Rio de Janeiro, British colonies in the Mauritius, South Africa, and India, not to mention rulers in Greece, Singapore, the Ottoman Empire, and Morocco. It was only a matter of time before legislation against marijuana would hit the Americas. Let's jump ahead to 1914, when the United States Congress passed the Harrison Narcotic Act, which greatly impacted the opium trade. Opioids can no longer be dispensed without a prescription, and all narcotics manufacturers and distributors had to be registered under the U.S. Treasury Department. Soon after, morphine, cocaine, heroin, and other hard substances were completely prohibited by federal law. Despite cannabis being untouched by this new law, it undoubtedly foreshadowed trouble on the horizon. Then came the Volstead Act of 1919, more commonly known as the Prohibition Act. While it didn't take effect until 1920, that new law was responsible for banning the sale or distribution of all alcoholic beverages. This lasted until 1933. America was running dry, and crimes were running higher. Here's a little advice from us. If you happen to find yourself thrown back into this era, watch out for Chicago Thunder. So how did all these new laws impact Mary Jane? Substances that were widely available now came with suffocating restrictions. The rise in addiction-related crimes, the beginnings and boomings of black market drugs, misinformation, and exploitation was the perfect combination to stir up a growing fear amongst the general population. Marijuana's reputation as a safe substance had been flipped. It didn't take long for the madness to spread. Reefer madness came to America's screens in 1936. The exploitation film attempted to portray a dark, cautionary tale to warn young people and their parents about the dangerous devil's lettuce and get them back on the path of the straight and narrow. It used highly exaggerated false claims about the drug to push its narrative, the most infamous being that cannabis would get the users so high that it would drive them to insanity, causing them to commit heinous acts like murder. The melodramatic picture with its bold, iconic posters dripping with occult imagery had a bit of an unintended effect, with the target audience finding it more a comedy than a drama, especially if you were high at the time. No wonder it gained a cult following. Jumping forward briefly, we see decades later in the distant year of 2005, a parody musical of Reefer Madness featuring a very special guest, Jesus, was born. It was very popular with stoners. Anyway, back to the 1930s. An article written by the head of the United States Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Harry Anslinger, titled "Marijuana, Assassin of Youth," was published in 1937, just a year after Reefer Madness was released. Anslinger wrote that ignorance about the effects of cannabis was the cause of criminal activity, murder, and insanity. That sure sounds familiar. In that same year, the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 was passed. A yearly tax was placed on all imports, selling and distributing under regulation, and failure to pay was met with prison time and a fine. Legal but heavily regulated, the recreational use of weed started its decline. At least not all was snubbed into an ashtray. The hemp industry was still going. Medical marijuana was still accessible under the right circumstances, but how long would that last? In 1942, cannabis was removed from the U.S. pharmacopoeia. Despite the reputation of weed being linked to the shady underground of crime, that didn't stop breakthroughs in research involving the herb. Israeli chemist Raphael Mechoulam isolated and identified THC, that little mind-altering chemical we mentioned earlier, and the structure of cannabinol, CBD, in 1964. This allowed more in-depth studies on just how weed affected the human brain. By isolating THC and using CBD, the medical benefits used for centuries were now accessible without the psychoactive high. But don't count THC out yet. More information was discovered during the study on how THC could be used in therapeutic treatments. During the 60s, a new era of free love was emerging, and Mary Jane became linked to the hippies, who brought with them a wave of new revolution against social norms through the use of fashion, political rebellion pushing the call for peace, and love over war. And of course, music, sexuality, freedom of expression, and psychedelics. Cannabis use was extremely popular amongst those involved in the movement. 1967 saw the Summer of Love. Hundreds of thousands of people flooded the streets of the Haight-Ashbury district located in San Francisco in celebration of freedom, peace, art, music, good vibes, and getting blazed. Flower power. This unplanned but significant event caught mass media attention, and not everyone was happy about this new movement. Enter, stage left, the 37th President of the United States, Richard Nixon. Nixon was primed to start a war, and his target was narcotics. The war on drugs was declared in 1971. Nixon stated drug abuse was the American public's greatest enemy, while in private hoping to use cannabis as a cudgel against his predominantly hippie and black political opponents. Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act, which listed cannabis as Schedule I narcotic, putting it in the same category as hard substances like heroin. Drugs in this category are deemed to have the highest risk of being abused and contain no medical value. In 1973, the Drug Enforcement Administration was brought together by combining the Office for Drug Abuse Law Enforcement, the Office of Narcotics Intelligence, and the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs to further crack down on these new laws. How could it possibly escalate from here? Well, the answer comes from the 1980s. Tricky Dick was out of the pick, and Ronald Reagan was now the United States president. During his presidency from 1981 to 1989, Reagan held his stance firm that marijuana had no place amongst the American public. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 poured more U.S. federal funding into drug enforcement, creating a minimum sentence for any drug-related crimes and increasing the monetary and incarceration penalties for those crimes. Heroin, crack cocaine, and marijuana were among the most common narcotics involved. The arrests and incarcerations for drug crimes such as possession saw a massive spike. A pretty intense sentence for a small herb, but why? Marijuana was often called a gateway drug. Thus, it was argued that it was just as dangerous as the other Schedule I narcotics it shared the list with. President Reagan's wife, Nancy Reagan, was also heavily involved in this war, privately funding a new campaign, Just Say No, in response to the concerns of rising drug abuse and crimes against school-aged children. Then came the Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program, or DARE, founded in 1983 in Los Angeles. You might be familiar with it, or at the very least familiar with its legendarily corny PSAs. This program infiltrated schools across the U.S., taught by police officers accompanied by a cartoon lion mascot called Darren the Lion. Incorporating the Just Say No campaign into its works, presenting the dangers of addiction and strategies to combat peer pressure through speaking at schools across America before they set off on a global campaign equipped with the aforementioned corny public service announcements. One of the more bizarre but infamous PSAs came from 1987, This Is Your Brain on Drugs. It depicts a man picking up an egg, claiming it to be the brain, then cracking it into a hot skillet. The skillet, of course, the drugs. The egg sizzles away while menacingly holding the frying pan, asking the audience if they have any questions. Needless to say, even today it's often referenced in parody. In 1996, California became the first state to legalize the medicinal use of cannabis under Proposition 215, the Compassionate Use Act of 1996, a historical milestone for the campaign to legalize medical marijuana in America. Just a year prior, bills were approved by state legislatures but were vetoed by the state governor at the time, Peter Wilson. When this happened, advocates of the cause didn't back down. They took the vote to the people, and the people said yes. 14 states soon legalized the use of medical cannabis, and the times were a-changin', not just in the US. Weed became legal for medical use in the Netherlands in 2000, followed by Canada in 2001, before later becoming legal, at least for medical use, in Austria circa 2008, and Uruguay, Italy, Romania, and the Czech Republic, as well as France in 2013. There were plenty more after that, but we respect your time and figure you'd probably just get sick of us listing off different country names. Back to the old US of A. Weed in pop culture became more mainstream in the 90s and 2000s, even popularizing a previously niche subgenre of the film, stoner comedies or stoner films. We think the title explains it all. Non-exploitation films surrounding marijuana can be dated back to the 60s with Easy Rider in 1969. But that film is far from giggles and good vibes. The comedy part of stoner comedy started back in 1978 with Up in Smoke, starring now iconic duo Richard Anthony Cheech Marin and Tommy Chong. But what about the music, man? Weed was heavily associated with music icon Snoop Dogg, featuring references to the drug since his debut on Dr. Dre's 1992 album titled The Chronic. Snoop wasn't shy about his love of marijuana, speaking publicly about his personal use and support in the movement to legalize weed. One of his most popular singles came from 2001 with Smoke Weed Every Day, still one of the world's most beloved stoner anthems. In 2015, Leafs by Snoop was founded, making its own cannabis strains and products like edibles. Given the highly radicalized nature of the war on marijuana, which we can thank Nixon for, it's definitely a step in the right direction for black pop culture figures like Snoop Dogg to finally profit off the plant that the government was previously using to haul them off to jail. While the legalization of marijuana for medical use has a pretty illustrious history at this point, the legal battles of recreational marijuana, especially in the United States, have been considerably more fraught. In 2012, Colorado and Washington became the first states to legalize recreational use of pot. As of today, despite marijuana still being forbidden on a federal level, 38 U.S. states, 3 territories, and the District of Columbia allow the use of medical cannabis. But which was the first country to fully legalize it? That title belongs to Uruguay. In 2013, it completely legalized cannabis for medical and recreational use, landmarking it as the first country in the world to make weed completely legal. And since then, it's been joined by some illustrious fellow weed havens: Georgia, South Africa, Canada, Mexico, Malta, Thailand, and Luxembourg. And given that none of these countries have fully collapsed into the purge-like anarchy since legislation, it's safe to say a lot of the fear-mongering of the past was probably overblown. Current United States President Joe Biden stated in 2022 that he would pardon prior offenses of possession of cannabis, encouraging state governors to follow his example. Biden asked for the cooperation of the Secretary of Health and Human Resources and the Attorney General to start the process needed to get a revision of that decision. Progress for marijuana advocates has been forced to take baby steps throughout most of recent history. But if the waves of legalization across the 2010s remain an enduring trend, the 2020s are likely to be an extremely good decade for the dankest among us. Regardless of whether you partake yourself, there's no denying that weed truly has a remarkable history. From its humble rise as a simple crop, to its blazing fall as a narcotic, to its revival as medicine, and maybe someday as a normalized drug like alcohol, caffeine, and tobacco. There's so much history and mystery we still don't know about. If only plants could talk. Yeah, they might take over the world or something, but as long as those plants can keep it mellow, it's a small price to pay.